Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 5, Halacha 2. Today we're going to be covering about luf and Sheviis laws on luf. Luf is going to be a malochet between the Rambam and between Rashi. Rashi is going to say it's a type of bean. And you can see that over in Baba Metzia 113b in the Rashi there. The Rambam is saying that it's actually going to be leek. It's going to be like a type of onion. It's going to be a leek. So we're going to be working as if it's a type of leek on this Mishnah and Gemara. Now, I want to talk about growing onions and leeks and other kinds of things like turnips or beets as well. This would also apply on what's coming up. So they have something called seed onions, okay? Seed onions would be something where there's two options. One is it's actually the seed, and two is going to be where they're the little bulbs that were left over. They're very, very little, and you keep them over from the year before, and then you plant them, and they'll grow into big onions, and sometimes they'll even multiply. And in fact, in modern stores today, when you're buying seed onions, usually you're buying these little tiny bulbs that you plant, and then they're going to grow into big ones. And another reason why you might want to do it is not just for the fruit, or the onion, but also could be where you want to actually grow it into collect more seed so that you're not going to harvest it at all. Actually, what you're going to do is you're going to let it grow, and it's going to flower, and it's going to get seeds, and then you're going to harvest those seeds so you can plant the crop with planting the seeds. But these little seed onions, the same would be for these other plants, like the leek, will be where you can have one that is from an earlier season. You want to replant it so that it's really like a seed onion, and then it will grow and develop and get nutrients and moisture from the soil, and you've effectively planted. Now, we know that in Sheviis, you're going to have an issue. Now, the other case about onions, about potatoes, leeks, turnips, beets, is that, in a day when they didn't have refrigeration, they would do it in a way where they would actually store it in the soil. So what's going to be coming up is, well, in Sheviis, is it going to be a case where this guy is going to be planting seed onions, or is it a case where this guy is going to be using the ground as storage, and what's what? So that's part of what's going on with the discussion in this halacha. Now we know that you can't plant during Sheviis, so that even if you were taking these seed onions and then you're replanting them, well, they're going to be taking root in the Sheviis year. You've actually planted. So that's going to be a problem. So the Mishnah is going to start off like this. It's going to say, one who buries luf during Sheviis in order to preserve it. Rabbi Meir says he may not bury less than 2 seah, piled to a height of 3 tefachim, with a tefach of dirt on top of it. And in order to avoid the appearance of planting, he has to come up with a lot of rules. First, he has to have at least 2 seah of luf in a storage hold, and then he has to remove it in a way where there's not going to be suspicion that it's going to all be planted like these seed onions, and he has to pile up all the luf or these onions in a hold up to 3 tefachim, and the idea is that with all these luf bulbs that says in Marafulda that are planted, they are going to be scattered about, but if you're stacking them up, it's going to make it obvious to the owner that these are being stored and not planted. And finally, on top of this dirt, on top of the stack, they have to cover it with a layer of dirt, at least a tefach thick. It's not just a thin layer. A thin layer is what you would do on when you're planting it, but this has to be actually a much thicker layer so that it's clear that you're not using it for planting. You're using it so that the moisture keeps it, the moisture in the soil keeps it from drying out. It keeps it nice and cool, and it's being used as cold storage, so to speak. So part of the idea is the thickness of the dirt is actually going to be creating a covering. And the sages are actually going to be agreeing with Rabbi Meir that this covering of dirt has to be at least a tefach thick. Now, the Gemara says that, the Mishnah says, but the sages say he may not bury less than 4 kav piled to a height of 1 tefach with a tefach of dirt on top of it, and he must bury it in a place upon which people tread. So the sages are saying that, look, you have to put it in a place where people are walking about all the time. The Rambam says that the constant trampling is going to prevent sprouting, and the Chazan Ish is saying that in his 12.3 here, that in his Shenas Eliyahu 12.3, is saying that the last condition where it has to be trampled by everybody is going to be agreed by everybody, the sages and Rabbi Meir. And Chazan Ish also says that possibly even just this last condition where it's on a place where people can trample it is sufficient on its own. So what this Mishnah is saying is that there are 4 conditions that have to be done in order to use the ground for storage on the Sheviis. So the first is you have a minimum amount that has to be put into a hold, and in Rabbi Meir's conception it's going to be 12 kav. The sage's conception is going to be 4 kav. The idea of Rabbi Meir, it has to be substantial enough and piled all together so that there's no mistake that it's really being getting set up to be scattered around the field and ready to get planted. And the second condition that's being described in the Mishnah is that the minimum height of the pile has to be at least 3 tefachim, according to Rabbi Meir. Again, he wants a more substantial look to this so that it's clear and obvious to everyone that this is not being used. Again, this is when you're taking it out of storage so that you can put it into the ground as storage when you're collecting it all together. And, why would you be taking it out of your own storage barn or something like that? Well, if you left it in the ground, it would just get soggy and moldy and the rain would just destroy it. So it would be no good. So you're putting it into a cold, cool, dry place for cold storage over the season, and then you're going to be putting it into the ground because it's going to keep it better than if you're keeping it in a dry place. So the third condition is going to be that, and by the way, everybody agrees on it, that there has to be at least a tefach thick covering of dirt on top of this. And the fourth is that, and everybody agrees with this, says the Chazan Ish, that it has to be in a place where people walk. In other words, that it's not being put out into the field for, like where it looks like in a place where it could be planted. It's really being put into a public walking area. And that's why, it's obvious that this is not being done in a field. Now, we're going to move on to another thing more about loof, but generally speaking, when Sheviis produce is no longer available in the fields, and by the way, the calculation for that is based upon when animals can no longer forage from that. So it's out of season, okay? It just exited this season. So the law over there, and again, the calculation for knowing this is that it's not available for the animals to graze on anymore. And the law is going to be that whatever quantity was already gathered and stored in your house, it has to be taken out of the house and you have to declare it ownerless. This, by the way, is called Beur. Now, this mission is going to have a dispute about who can acquire that Beur Sheviis produce, after it's already left the field. It's just not growing there anymore. But you have it piled up in your house. You have it in your own storage in your house. So the idea is you have to take it out of the house, declare it ownerless. But the question is, who can take it? Okay. Now, Rabbi Yehuda is holding that the poor are going to have this right, and it's only going to be the poor. Rabbi Yossi is saying that both the rich and the poor are going to be entitled. Now, it's going to look like Rabbi Yehuda is going to be taking the position of Bet Shammai, and it's going to look like Rabbi Yossi is going to be taking the position of Bet Hillel. Now, this comes up elsewhere in Masechet Peah as a debate between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai on what is the status of Hefker and who can take it. And the idea is going to be that, according to Bet Hillel, that Hefker really means that it's Hefker. You can't make conditions on it. That means that anybody can take it, even rich. And that if, according to Bet Hillel, you made a condition that only poor people can take it and not anyone else, then it's not really ownerless. So you've never actually made it ownerless, according to Bet Hillel. Now, the types of produce that are always going to be in season are not going to be subject to Beur because they're always there in the field for the animals to graze on. Now, the Torah gives this right to the animals, both wild and domestic. And this, by the way, is a calculation for when it's available. Now, what's making loof, this leek, so interesting and why it's not subject to Beur is because it will survive in the winter and it can become available in the field throughout the year. Now, the issue would be here is that the leaves are going to be subject to Beur because they are not going to survive the winter, just the bulb will. Now, the Mishnah is going to be talking about the loof plant that's going to have both Sheviis and non-Sheviis leaves. So, if you have it where the loof was left over in the ground and the bulb is there and the leaves all died from the year earlier and it sprouts new leaves, and this is on the Sheviis year, well, those leaves are going to have Sheviis sanctity. And what can you use the leaves for? Well, first of all, the animals are going to graze on it. But second of all, you can use the leaves specifically to make soups and stocks. They're very good for soups and stocks. So the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say a loof over which Sheviis passed. That's going to be where the loof grew from the 7th year to the 8th year, and its leaves grew partially in the 7th year and partially in the 8th year. Then the time for Beur arrives in the 8th year. So because the time for Beur is going to be in the 8th year, and it's going to be where, well, I mean, it's interesting because, this is a case like, these other fruits we were covering, where part of it is going to be over more than 1 year, and what's going to be the status of it. And this effectively is saying that when when it enters the 8th year, it's still going to have some Sheviis sanctity. So Rabbi Lazer in this Mishnah says that if the poor people picked its leaves during the 7th year, when the produce is hefker for everyone, they have picked them. And whatever leaves are present on the loof when the owner picks it is not in the 8th year, and that's going to be his, since the 8th year produce is not going to be subject to the Sheviis law. So the Mishnah is going to continue with Rabbi Lazer saying that, but if not, in other words, if the loof's leaves were not picked during Sheviis, so that the leaves are now present, and it's going to be the 8th year, and it's going to be on the loof plant a mixture of 7th year leaves and 8th year leaves, then the owner must make an accounting with the poor. And the idea here, says the Mara Fulda, is that he has to calculate the percent of the leaves that grew in the Sheviis and give that percent to the poor. And the remaining portion, which is from the 8th year, can be retained by him. So the idea is that if you have leaves that grew in the 7th year and are now being picked in the 8th year, the calculation is which of the 7th year leaves are holdover, being picked in the 8th year, but grew on the 7th year. You have to calculate that. You have to give it to the poor. And whatever grew on its own in the 8th year, that's going to be different. In other words, the issue is coming up where you have these leaves that are where the bulb is in the ground and leaves sprout up, and some of the leaves are 7th year leaves and some of the leaves are 8th year leaves, but all of the leaves are picked in the 8th year. Well, the 7th year leaves are still going to have Sheviis sanctity. That's going to be the idea. And what happens with this? Well, the leftover part that's going to be just on the 8th year, in other words, it grew on the 8th year and it's harvested on the 8th year, that is going to be kept by the owner. Now, Rabbi Yeshua is going to say in this Mishnah that if the poor people picked its leaves during Sheviis, they indeed picked them. In other words, the idea is that the leaves were already removed by the poor people, and the idea is it's hefker for everyone, and there's obviously going to be nothing to settle because it was already picked. And what's going to be coming up is going to be, the issue. In other words, that Rabbi Lazer is also holding that, if the poor people pick the leaves during the Sheviis 7th year, when the produce is hefker for everyone, that's, going to be picked, and there's no accounting. The case with Rabbi Lazer is going to be what happens if nobody picked any of the leaves in the 7th year, and all of the leaves are picked in the 8th year, and you have some 7-year leaves and some 8-year leaves. Rabbi Yeshua is going to continue, is going to say, but if not, the poor have no account with him, and the owner may keep all of the leaves for himself. So that's where the dissent is. So Rabbi Yeshua is saying that in the 8th year, even if you have 7th year leaves that are on the plant, and you're picking it on the 8th year, and you're picking 8th year leaves that grew in the 8th year, and 7th year leaves that were not collected by the poor in the 7th year, and it's now the 8th year and the guy's harvesting, well, Rabbi Yeshua is basically saying that there's nothing for the poor person to do. He has no claim on the owner. The owner can take everything, even the 7th year leaves, for himself. Now, the idea is going to be that you have this declaration of it being ownerless, and the idea is that because it's ownerless, well, the owner comes along and basically claims them. He's basically saying that, the 7th year produce that came after this Beur, where, it's been left out and it's hefker, and it was never collected by any poor people as their property. And so now in the 8th year, when he's doing the harvest anyway, he's just collecting the hefker. So now the Mishnah is going to talk about digging up. There's a lot of halachas in this Mishnah. So the Mishnah now is going to talk about digging up the loof during Sheviis and other species that are going to be like these bulbs. It can be onions, it can be turnips, it can be potatoes, garlic would work. Anyway, leek, we're talking about leek here. And the idea is that these bulbs, all right, they finish the growth in the 6th year, and all of the plants, have roots, and these roots are going to be these bulbs, right? So like onions and beets and things like that. So these tubers, they're going to be dug up and they're going to be retrieved. Now the issue here is going to be that if this is done in the 7th year, and even if it grew in the 6th year, it's going to look like you're working the land. It's going to look like you're actually preparing the land. You're not actually harvesting. It's going to look like to the guy walking by, you're not actually harvesting. You're actually digging up the land to get out weeds and to get the land nice and loosened up so that you can plant in the 7th year. It's not going to look like you're harvesting. It's going to look like you're planting. So that's going to be the worry. So the Mishnah says, loof of the year before Sheviis that entered Sheviis, that's still attached to the ground, and so too Zonin onions. We're going to explain what those are, and so too madder, says the Mishnah, madder, M-A-D-D-E-R. That's the English translation. That's going to be growing in fertile soil, and the roots of madder, says the Marafulda, are going to be used to make red dyes. And Bet Shammai is going to say that one must uproot them with spades of wood. So Marafulda says about this that when you're going to uproot these Sheviis loof and onions, these Kitsonim onions and the madder, and it's going to be growing in fertile soil, Bet Shammai is going to prohibit using a metal tool, and he's going to make you use a wooden one. The idea is that Bet Shammai does not want to make it look like you are working the land. And what's the best way to work the land? With metal tools. So Bet Hillel says that he may uproot them even with mattocks of metal. In other words, that Bet Hillel here is very lenient, and he's going to allow him to use even metal-bladed instruments like a mattock, which is like a pickaxe, or an adze, which is like a pickaxe, and these are used for digging. And Bet Hillel is requiring just a small change from how they're normally doing it. So one of the ideas, says the Chazan Ish, is that you're using only a mattock of metal and you're not using a metal spade. I guess normally you'd be using a metal spade. So you're using a little bit more clumsy digging tool to get it out. And that's going to be enough as a siman that you're really not doing it the optimal way. You're not doing it the normal way you'd be harvesting with like a metal spade. You're using this also digging tool, but it's a little bit clumsy to use for getting out onions and things like that. So what's interesting about this, says the Chazan Ish, is that the loof, Kitsonim onions, and madder going to be this thing that's going to be used for red dye. We have to change the way we're going to harvest it, and that a significant change is going to be required according to Bet Shammai, and a minor one is going to be according to Bet Hillel. But what's interesting is not regarding other plants, and this is because these 3 plants in particular lie embedded deeply in the earth, and digging them up is going to look like plowing. But other vegetables don't grow as deeply, and so uprooting them is not going to look like plowing. That's going to be the explanation by the Chazan Ish, and that's a great, beautiful way to understand it. And the Mishnah is going to continue. Really, a lot of halachas in this Mishnah. Normally a Mishnah will have like maybe 6, but this one has more than that. So Mishnah continues and says, and Bet Shammai admits to Bet Hillel regarding matter of tzilos, that one may uproot them even with mattocks of metal. So the Gemara coming up is going to talk about tzilos being rocky ground. And the idea is that since it's going to be very, very rocky, and it's really not normal for people to plant there, people are not going to suspect them of working the ground, so that even in a place where it's so rocky you don't normally plant this stuff there, Bet Shammai is going to let you use this metal tool there, because otherwise you just can't get it out. It's too rocky. Now, the Mishnah is going to conclude with the final ruling on loof. This is really everything you want to know about loof on the 7th year for leeks. And the Mishnah says, from when is a person permitted to buy loof in the year following Sheviis, even from a person who is suspected of being a Sheviis merchant? In other words, says the Rosh Cirilio, produce is that produce that is of the possible Sheviis origin is not allowed to be purchased from those who suspect that the Sheviis observance is not really that good, because they might be a Sheviis merchant, and there's a lot of curses for Sheviis merchants. There's a Gemara in the Bavli, it's in Kiddushin, that talks about that you become ultimately so poor, measure for measure, you're not relying on Hashem and the word of Hashem, and instead you're trying to do business with something that Hashem forbade, and measure for measure you'll become so poor that you'll even have to sell your daughter to become a maid. And it's really, there's a sugya by Rabbi Akiva that says that you've betrayed your daughter. Not only did you betray the Torah, you betrayed Hashem, you betrayed yourself, but that you will continue to do this up until, and you will not make tshuva up until you become that poor where you actually have to sell your daughter to be a maid. And being a Sheviis merchant carries a lot of curses, and you'll not get blessing out of doing business with Sheviis produce. You'll not see blessing in it. Just Shemayim will not let it happen, because the Torah is true, and you're it's like a total lack of faith in what the Torah says. So the universe will be arranged in a way where you're just not going to get any blessing. So Rabbi Yehuda says in this Mishnah, again, the idea is going to be up to when can you buy loof in the next year, in like the 8th year, even from somebody who might be a Sheviis merchant. And Rabbi Yehuda says immediately after Sheviis, but the sages say only from when the new 8th year crop of loof outnumbers the remnants of the 7th year crop. So there's a difference here. The sages are saying when you have a majority of 8th year loof, the buyer can assume that he's probably buying the majority, and he doesn't need to worry that it was picked in the 7th year. And the idea of Rabbi Yehuda is going to be that vegetables may not be purchased after Sheviis from a person who is a suspected Sheviis merchant until you have other vegetables that came in season that are the same ones that he's selling. And regarding loof, though, he's going to rule that it may be purchased immediately after Sheviis. And there's going to be a Gemara that comes up here to explain the difference. That Gemara is actually not going to be in this halacha, but it will come up. So perhaps loof can stay around a while. Perhaps it might be 6th year loof, and they'll stay for a while in cold storage, and perhaps he's selling something that did not grow in the 7th year. But regarding every other kind of crop, Rabbi Yehuda does not dispute it. The only question is going to be on loof. Now, let's get to the Gemara. So we were talking about burying loof, and now the Gemara is going to ask, so far we learned the law for loof, but what about ordinary onions, which are also going to be commonly buried in the ground to preserve them? So the question is going to be, is this going to have the same status for leeks as for onions on the Sheviis year? And there's going to be two different opinions. Rabbi Yonah says loof and onions are the same, and Rabbi Yosa says it is logical in regard to ordinary onions to say that even less than this amount is permitted, because ordinary onions are smooth. So what does that mean about being smooth? Well, Mara Fulda says about this that because they're smooth, they can be packed more closely together than loof. And since even less than 2 seah, according to Rabbi Meir, or 4 kav, according to the sages, are going to be recognized as being a storage pile. So it's going to make sure that people are not suspecting that they're going to be put into the ground for the purpose of planting. Now, so if you're piling them together, it's going to really be more recognizable as a pile than trying to pile up some leeks. That's basically what they're saying. And the Mishnah stated that a loof over which Sheviis passed. So it must be that in the halacha that it's going to be, the question is going to be, is this prescribed amount going to be the same for loof and for onion? And it looks like it's going to look like, it's going to look like whatever restrictions are going to apply to loof are going to apply to onions as well. That's what the Rambam is saying about this. But again, you have another opinion that perhaps, onions are a little bit different because it's going to look like you're able to put them into a storage pile without it being suspected of planting. So, but the Rambam does rule that loof and onions are going to be the same. Now, Mishnah is going to say, okay, loof over which Sheviis passed, and the Gemara is going to explain Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yeshua's opinions, and Rabbi Abahu says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in the Mishnah below is going to follow the opinion of Rabbi Lezer in the Mishnah, while Rabbi Yossi's opinion in the Mishnah is going to follow the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua in this Mishnah. And the Gemara continues, says, we learned there in the Mishnah over in 9.6 in Sheviis, that's going to be coming up. It's going to say like this. It's going to say that the poor may eat the produce after Beur, that's when it's brought out to be hefker and it's no longer available in the field, but not the rich. And these are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yosef says both the poor and the rich may eat after Beur. So in other words, according to Rabbi Yosef, the owner himself may repossess the same produce that he declared ownerless from the time of Beur. And Rabbi Yeshua in this Mishnah is going to agree with Rabbi Yosef, and he's going to rule that if the poor did not precede the owner in picking the loof during Sheviis, they're going to belong to the owner, and therefore the poor is not going to have any claim against the owner. So the idea is that when produce gets declared ownerless at the time of Beur, again, that's when animals can no longer graze for it in the field, only the poor can take possession of it, not the rich. And in this Mishnah, Rabbi Meir is holding the position of Rabbi Yehuda, and he's basically holding that the loof's 7th year leaves have to be given to the poor. And the idea is that it can't be taken by the field owner because it can only be given to the poor. Rabbi Lezer's position is that this guy who has the field is rich, and it can only be taken by the real, serious poor of Am Yisrael, not people who are landowners. And therefore, it was never a valid hefker where the guy claimed it. He never actually claimed it. And that's quite a departure from the other opinion, which is that, hey, look, he left it out, and the poor could have collected it, and then he came and he collected it, and it's his property. So 2 very different opinions. Now, we're going to get into this dispute between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yeshua in the Mishnah, and Rabbi Imi is going to ask a question in the presence of his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan, and the Gemara says, was the Mishnah composed before the sages decreed a prohibition against aftergrowths? Well, that's a good question. So there's a rabbinical thing that came up where they're going to prohibit aftergrowths in the 7th year. So it's not d'oraita forbidden, but it's d'Rabbanan forbidden. So the question is going to be like this, right? If it's going to be like what Rabbi Yimi is saying, basically he's really asking, he says, how could it be that Rabbi Lazer and Rabbi Yeshua are going to say that if the poor pick the loose leaves, they have been picked? And that would imply that they can eat it when it gets picked. And the idea is going to be that aftergrowths are going to be forbidden to anybody, even the poor. And so basically, they would be picking aftergrowths. So the idea is that although they planted crops, and that's going to be prohibited during Sheviis, there's going to be some plants that sprout simultaneously during Sheviis from seeds that fell on the ground before the harvest of the last year. So these are going to be sefachim, which are going to be the aftergrowths, and these are forbidden. So there's a dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the sages whether the sefachim is going to be d'oraita or d'Rabbanan. Obviously, Rabbi Akiva is going to hold that it's going to be d'oraita. He's going to say from Leviticus 25 or Vayikra 25:20, he's going to say, and if you will say, what will we eat in the seventh year? Behold, we will not sow and we will not gather in our crops. And basically, Rabbi Akiva's point is going to be that the wording of the people's question is redundant, because if they do not sow, of course, they will not gather any crops, since nothing is going to grow because they didn't sow. So Rabbi Akiva is saying that this redundancy is actually going to be referring to aftergrowths, and people are going to basically be saying that neither can you sow and collect what you were sowing, nor these seeds of the aftergrowths, you can't collect these either. And so that basically they're saying that you can't sow new crops, and whatever grew spontaneously from seeds that dropped into the ground during the last year's growth and harvest, you also can't do that. The sages are saying that no, these aftergrowths, these sefachim, these are going to be the Rabbanan. And the idea is going to be that all the growths are going to be Rabbanan. And the rabbis were afraid that if aftergrowths were left and you were allowed to take it, then what would happen is you would have cheaters that would come along and they would plant seeds in the year when nobody was looking. And then when the seeds would grow, they would claim that it's going to be aftergrowths, and then they would come and they would do business with it and they would eat it. And basically the rabbis are trying to cut off any kind of trickery, any kind of games. And that's going to be the idea. So in this Gemara, Rabbi Imi obviously going to be following the view of the sages that it's going to be d'Rabbanan. And so that's why he's asking this question about whether this Mishnah is going to come from the time before the rabbis are going to be forbidding the consumption of aftergrowths, or is it not? And that's a very good question. Now, Rabbi Yochanan rejects this question, and I think it's a good question, but Rabbi Yochanan rejects it. He says, were you present in the upper chamber when they decreed against aftergrowths? So basically, there was when you have the prohibition of sefachim, and it's going to be a rabbinic in origin, basically, they're suggesting that the Mishnah was composed before the law of sefachim was enacted, and it was customary to do rabbinic decrees in the upper chamber. That's the note by the Rosh. And basically, by stating that this particular law originated in the upper chamber is another way of saying that it's rabbinic. And there's a version in the London manuscript, also in the Rome manuscript, that that words this differently. That says, was it the prohibition against sefachim, being basically the prohibition of sefachim, was that formulated in the upper chamber? So that's a different way to read it and understand it if that's the original writing of it. So Rabbi Imi is going to think about what Rabbi Yochanan says and comes back to him and says, Rabbi Imi understood Rabbi Yochanan to be saying that the prohibition of aftergrowths is biblical. So accordingly, it's not possible to say that the Mishnah was composed before the decree of aftergrowths and that it was decreed in the upper chamber. But then it becomes a problem, because how could Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yeshua state that if the poor people picked the loose leaves, they picked it? And if they were picking it and it had Sheviis sanctity, well, then it should be forbidden as an aftergrowth. That even if this grew in the 7th year and you picked it in the 8th year, this 7th year leaf should still have Sheviis sanctity, and it should be forbidden as sefachim, as an aftergrowth. So the Gemara is going to propose a different solution for this. And Rabbi Yerushalmi says that the Mishnah refers to the leaves of the wild loof. This is going to be the bulb of the wild loof, that if you leave it alone, it will continue to grow for several years. And by the way, that's how you could have this opinion that with Rabbi Yeshua, that perhaps you on loof specifically, and only loof, that you can start to buy loof right after Sheviis ends, because perhaps it's not going to be a 7th year loof, perhaps it'll be an 6th year loof. So these last a long time. And the case is going to be where you had the wild loof and it was planted in the 6th year, and it grew out through the 7th year, and it grew into the 8th year. And so since the loof began growing before Sheviis, it's not going to be subject to the prohibition of aftergrowth at all. And Rabbi Yerushalmi is going to explain it and challenge it. And Rav Hoshaya brought a brisa to Bar Kapara from the south, which taught the dispute of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua with regards to both the leaves of the loof and the leaves of the onions. And it's going to say, can you possibly say that the brisa is referring to the leaves of wild onions which grow for several years? Basically, they're saying that it can't be, because onions are just going to grow for a single season. So Bar Kapara is going to be basically proving that the case is not where the loof began growing in the 6th year. Rather, we must say, like Rabbi Imi, that aftergrowths are prohibited only to Rabbanan, and the Mishnah is going to predate this decree against aftergrowths. So that's going to be the explanation on this by the Chazan Ish in 9.8. Break this up into a 2-part shiur so we can cover it in more depth tomorrow. Anyway, this is some really important stuff, and it forces us to think about the details and laws of Sheviis in a deeper and richer way. Have a great day.